Bashing the Benko by David Goodman. In recent years, the Benko gambit has been enjoying a period of great popularity. Many players of all strengths seem to be turning to this gambit as their main weapon against pawn to queen 4. The reasons for this are complex, but may be summarized as follows. After the initial 1, pawn to queen 4, knight to king's bishop 3, 2, pawn to queen's bishop 4, pawn to queen's bishop 4, 3, pawn to queen 5, pawn to queen's knight 4, 4, pawn takes pawn, pawn to queen's rook 3, 5, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn. Diagram 1. Black has a leading development and already has a clear and concrete plan of action. By occupying the queen's rook and queen's knight files with his rooks and fianchettoing his king's bishop, he intends to exert pressure against white's queen side. Black is seen to have gained initiative at a very early stage, and white is immediately placed at a psychological disadvantage at being forced on the defensive so early. Also, black's counterplay in return for the sacrificed pawn is supposed to follow, almost like clockwork, whilst any mistake by white is supposed to lead to instant disaster. In this cassette, I intend to question the validity of the Benko gambit, and to suggest lines which, in my opinion, are very good for white. First, however, I feel I should point out that the title of the cassette was in no way meant to be arrogant, but more as a way of attracting people's attention. Now let's look at what many regard as a typical Benko gambit game. This is the game Lever Benko from the American Open played at California in 1967. After the position reached in diagram 1, Lever played 6, pawn to king's knight 3, pawn to queen 3, and the game now continued, bishop to knight 2, pawn to knight 3, knight to queen's bishop 3, bishop to king's knight 2, knight to bishop 3, castles, white plays 10 castles, queen's knight to queen 2, rook to knight 1, queen to rook 4, white plays 12, pawn to queen's rook 3, black plays king's rook to knight 1, white plays rook to king 1, black plays knight to king 1. And now we reach the position shown in diagram 2. This is the kind of position that many white players fear. Black's pieces have sprung into action with almost clockwork precision, and white seems to be facing a long, hard defensive struggle. In my opinion, similar positions to that in diagram 2, i.e. positions resulting from the main lines, are better for white. After all, as long as white is able to defend his extra pawn, then in the long run it is he that must have the winning chances. There are many games where white successfully defends A and B pawns, and later breaks out of his shell to queen his extra A pawn, hence the subtitle of this cassette. And I myself have in fact done this on a number of occasions. However, I imagine that many of you don't exactly relish the prospect of merely trying to contain black's pressure, and thus in this cassette I intend to suggest lines that cut across black's main strategy at its base, even before it has begun materializing. In this cassette I will be suggesting 3 different lines, all of which, in my opinion, lead to better positions for white. In all of these lines, white begins active operations almost immediately, and black is forced to deviate from his normal course. You may often be able to surprise your opponent using these lines, and your opponent will not be able to follow the clockwork mechanical development of the first 12 to 15 moves, which she is so used to reeling off almost without thinking. The 3 lines are not arranged in order of strength, but are merely arranged in an order which I found convenient. There is more available material for the 3rd plan, but this does not suggest that it is any better than the other 2. If any distinction can be made, it is that Plan A is more positional, whilst Plan C is basically tactical, and I leave it to the individual player concerned to choose which line he himself wishes to play. Before we begin to examine the first plan or line, just a quick word about the layout of this cassette. I'm suggesting 3 plans, and so the cassette's been divided into 3 different parts, and you'll always be able to tell when, when each part comes to an end, because there'll be some music in between, sort of brief interlude. This enables people who aren't able to listen to it for the full 90 minutes to listen to it in separate parts without affecting their understanding of the positions. Now Plan A. Now reset your pieces in the start position. One, pawn to queen 4, knight to king's bishop 3. 2, pawn to queen's bishop 4, pawn to bishop 4. 3, pawn to queen 5, pawn to queen's knight 4. Pawn takes pawn, pawn to queen's rook 3. And now white plays 5, pawn to king 3. This is the position shown in diagram A1. This move is seemingly passive and quiet, but is a prelude to more aggressive intentions. Black has 3 replies, or 3 sensible replies to this move. Pawn to queen 3, pawn takes pawn, or pawn to king 3. Black's 5th, pawn takes pawn, is weak, as white then has 6, bishop takes pawn, and if black plays queen to rook 4 check, knight to queen's bishop 3, knight to king 5, white has king's knight to king 2. White's pieces are well developed, and black doesn't seem to have enough play for the pawn. Now return to diagram A1. And we'll look at what happens if black plays 5, pawn to king 3 in reply to white's pawn to king 3. White's best is knight to queen's bishop 3, pawn takes queen's pawn, knight takes pawn, bishop to knight 2, threatening the knight, so white now plays knight takes knight check, black plays queen takes knight, white plays knight to king's bishop 3, and black plays bishop to queen 3. If instead of this black had played pawn to queen 4, so retract bishop on queen 3 to king's bishop 1 and play pawn to queen 4 instead, then white has pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, bishop to knight 5 check, and black hasn't got enough play again for the pawn. He's forced to play bishop to queen's bishop 3 in exchange of one of his potentially strongest pieces. Now I track the pieces to see what would have happened if black had played 9 bishop to king 2 instead of bishop to queen 3 or pawn to queen 4. Place black's queen's pawn back at queen 2, bishop at queen's knight 2, white's bishop retracted back to king's bishop 1. Now retract black's knight at rook 3 to knight 1, and place black pawns at queen's rook 3, and place a white pawn at queen's knight 5. Now if black, you don't need to make these moves on the board, just look at this. If black had played bishop to king 2 instead, then white simply plays pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and then bishop to king 2. White's a little better, he's getting his pieces developed, and he's got that extra pawn, which is potentially going to win the game for him. So black has just played 9 bishop to queen 3. Now switch off your cassette and examine what you think white's best move is here. White played bishop to queen 2, exclamation mark, with the idea of playing bishop to queen's bishop 3, thus controlling the important diagonal from white's queen's rook 1 to black's king's rook 1. Black now played the rather dangerous queen takes knight's pawn. This capture is often very dangerous, as in situations where black takes white's queen's knight pawn, white can usually get a lot of tempi in development attacking black's queen. White now plays 11 rook to queen's bishop 1. White's given the pawn back, but black's going to be very behind in development, and his queen's going to be in rather a lot of trouble soon. Black now played queen to bishop 3. This is necessary as a defence, otherwise white plays bishop to bishop 3, followed by bishop takes king's knight pawn. After queen to bishop 3 for black, white now plays bishop to queen's bishop 3, and black plays bishop takes knight. Again, I hope you can see that if black had played queen to king 2, then white has knight to rook 4 to bishop 5, which is a very strong square for the knight. And if and black can't play queen takes knight on rook 4, because then white has queen takes bishop. So black's just played bishop takes knight. Switch off your recorder and decide what you think is white's best capture. Should white capture with the queen and exchange queens, or is it best for him if he leaves the queen on? White played pawn takes bishop, exclamation mark. This shows white's aggressive intentions, and white seems to potentially have a lot of play on the white squares, with moves like bishop to queen's bishop 4 and queen to queen 5, or bishop to king's knight 2 and pawn to bishop 4. And white's white squared bishop's controlling a lot of squares on the board, while black's knight is rather out of it at the moment. Black now played bishop to king 4. White played bishop takes bishop, and black retook with the queen. And white played bishop to knight 2. This move threatens pawn to bishop 4, which simultaneously attacks the queen at king 4 and black's unmoved rook at queen's rook 1. This is position diagram A2. Black now played queen to bishop 2. If instead black had played queen to knight 7, white wins with pawn to bishop 4, forces rook to rook 2, the only square. White now plays castles. If black now plays castles, then white plays rook to queen's knight 1, followed by pawn to knight 6, winning the rook. So retract white's rook move and black's castles. And instead, if black had played, instead of castles, pawn takes pawn, then white has queen to queen 6. Queen to queen 6, which stops black's castling, and black's king's trapped in the centre, and white can play rook takes queen's bishop pawn, on king's rook to queen 1, and start coming in down the centre very fast. So return to the position in diagram A2. And now we'll return back to the main game. Black played queen to bishop 2. White played queen to queen 5. Black played queen to rook 4 check. And white played king to queen 1. This move may seem strange, but in fact black's king is much more exposed than white's, because black's pieces are undeveloped, and therefore he has no attack going against white's king. Black now played pawn takes pawn. And again, don't play it on the board, but just visualize that after rook to rook 2, white has queen to king 5 check, which wins black's knight. After pawn takes pawn, white plays queen to king 5 check, king to queen 1, queen takes knight's pawn, rook to king 1, queen to knight 5 check, king to bishop 2, queen takes bishop's pawn check, knight to bishop 3, 22, pawn to king's bishop 4, opening the diagonal for the bishop, rook to king 3, bishop to queen 5, rook to queen 3, king to king 2, removing white's king from the pin, rook takes bishop, queen takes rook, queen takes rook's pawn check, and queen takes queen, rook takes queen check, king to bishop 3, pawn to queen's knight 5, 28, king's rook to queen 1. This was the game Bagirov-Zerozevsky, which was played in the USSR in 1975, and is a convincing display of how white should play in this line. Black now resigned. Of course, black has no chance of getting his queen's knight pawn through as long as white plays properly, as white's 2 rooks can rather easily set up a blockade. Now let's return to the position in diagram A1 and play 5 pawn to queen 3 for black. White now plays 6. Before proceeding, pawn to queen 3 is the main move in this position. and it's what most players will play against you. White now played 6, knight to queen's bishop 3, pawn to king's knight 3, and white now plays pawn to queen's rook 4, exclamation mark, leading to position diagram 3. This is a relatively new idea, designed at stopping black's counterplay before it even starts. Black now plays 7, bishop to king's knight 2. White plays 8, queen to knight 3, leading to position diagram A4. If you're very lucky, your opponent may now play castles, whereupon you will play pawn to knight 6, threatening pawn to knight 7. Your opponent will have to play bishop to knight 2, and then you play pawn to rook 5, and you've got your knight's pawn rather a long way. It cuts a hole in black's position, and black's always going to have to keep a lot of pieces round it in order to block it. So therefore, after queen to knight 3, black plays pawn takes pawn. White now plays bishop takes pawn check. And now black has to make a decision between king's knight to queen 2 or bishop to queen 2. After bishop to queen 2, we are following the game Korchnoi Calvo, which was played at Palma de Mallorca in 1972, and which continued as follows. White now played 10, rook to rook 3, exclamation mark, diagram A5. This is really a very, very clever move, as white intends to answer bishop takes bishop with pawn takes bishop. And now white's got his extra pawn, and black may have to play rook takes rook. Then white plays pawn takes rook, and he's got 2 connected passed pawns on the queen's side. Black really shouldn't ever play rook takes rook. He should play queen's knight to queen 2 instead. But then examine this position. Black hasn't got the usual kind of play he normally gets in the Benko gambit. White's extra pawn, though doubled, is extra and safe. White can potentially double rooks on the queen's rook file, as black can never play rook takes rook because of pawn takes rook, creating the 2 connected passed pawns. Therefore black's got no play, and white just seems to be a pawn up. Now return to diagram A5, which is after white plays 10 rook to rook 3. Calvo played castles, and white played king's knight to king 2. This is a very important defensive resource, as black usually has a lot of tactical cheapos based on the bishop on king's knight 2 taking white's knight on queen's bishop 3. And by placing your king's knight at king 2, you're ruling out all these cheapos. Black now plays 11, knight to rook 3. White plays 12, castles. Black plays knight to bishop 2. White plays 13, bishop to bishop 4. Black plays rook to knight 1. Queen to bishop 2. White's now rather a lot better, as although black's got something resembling the usual queenside play in the Benko, white's got rather a lot of extra tempos, and his queenside's under no threat at all. Black plays bishop to bishop 1. White plays pawn to queen's knight 3. Bishop to queen's rook 3. Bishop to queen 2. Queen to bishop 1. Queen to queen 3. queen to knight 2. Black seems to be trying very hard to get play on the queen side, but there really isn't any in this position, because he can never play bishop takes bishop, because then white plays pawn takes bishop, safeguarding his centre, and he can follow up later with pawn to king 4, pawn to king's bishop 4, and pawn to king 5. White now played 18 pawn to king 4. Black played knight to queen 2, freeing his bishop and overprotecting the king 4 square. Pawn to bishop 4 by white. Knight to knight 3. Korchnoi now played 20, knight to knight 5. Bishop takes knight. Pawn takes bishop. Rook to rook 1. Rook takes rook, rook takes rook. Bishop to bishop 3. Bishop takes bishop. Knight takes bishop. Rook to rook 6. Korchnoi now played pawn to king 5. White stands a lot better here. His extra pawn is still safe, and he's about to break through the centre, and Korchnoi later went on to win the game. In his book, Benko attributes Korchnoi's victory to his fighting abilities rather than his opening novelty, but I don't agree. Korchnoi's innovation greatly reduced Black's play against White's queenside pawns, and so enabled him to play for a direct central breakthrough. What really ought to be clear is that unless Black does get this queenside play in the Benko gambit, then he's really got nothing, and White's just a pawn up. So these lines that cut out Black's play seem very strong. Now return to diagram A4. And Black now plays pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn check. We had this position before, and Calvo played bishop to queen 2 against Korchnoi. But Black can also play king's knight to queen 2, attempting to keep more tension in the position. Black intends to play knight to rook 3, to bishop 2, rook to knight 1, rook to queen's knight 1, and bishop to queen's rook 3, putting pressure on White's bishop. After king's knight to queen 2, White still plays rook to rook 3, and White can now follow up either with knight to king's bishop 3 to queen 2 to bishop 4, or perhaps better with king's knight to king 2, followed by castles and pawn to king 4. Again, as in the previous examples, if ever Black takes White's bishop on queen's knight 5, White recaptures with the pawn, thus stopping all the pressure down the queen's knight file. In all these variations in this plan, it's important to notice that the presence of the White king's knight on king 2, instead of on king's bishop 3, cuts out Black's tactical threats with bishop takes knight on queen's bishop 3. That's the end of plan A, and now before going on to examine plan B, there will be a short interlude. hope you found Plan A interesting, and now we'll go on to examine Plan B, or Plan 2, or whatever you want to call it. This line's very, very aggressive, and in Plan A, White tried to block out Black's play on the queen side. He tried to block up the queen side files by placing pieces there and defending them in such a way as Black would never get the usual pressure going. In this line, White tries to advance through the centre very quickly and establish a pawn at king 5, and thus block out Black's bishop at king's knight 2. With this bishop blocked out, then Black's play usually loses lots of its force. In this line, White gets his pawns going very fast and gets very strong play through the centre. This is different from what happens in many of the main lines, because in those, White usually has to spend time moving his king's knight and safeguarding his position before he can start pushing these pawns up. This line also uses the classical approach to a wing attack. White advances down the centre very fast, creates a lot of central pressure, and thus distracts a lot of Black's pieces away from the queen side. White has often got prospects of a very fast central breakthrough, and even a mating attack, and Black has set problems very early rather than White, which is what happens in the main lines. Now this is illustrative game 1 for Plan 2. This is the game Pelich-Platonov. Pawn to queen 4, knight to king's bishop 3. 2, pawn to queen's bishop 4, pawn to bishop 4. 3, pawn to queen 5, pawn to queen's knight 4, pawn takes pawn, pawn to queen's rook 3, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, knight to queen's bishop 3, pawn to king's knight 3, and now you play 7, pawn to king's bishop 4, exclamation mark. Turn off your cassette and think about this for a minute, and think about how you feel White ought to continue. The move pawn to king's bishop 4 controls the vital square where it's White's king 5, Black's king 4. Black often puts a knight here and tries to come into White's position. The only danger behind this move is that it may be weakening, and White may find himself overextended. If Black is able to break through down the queen's side, then he can sort of come round the back into White's position, and there aren't any pawns in the way to stop him. However, in this case, as long as White plays fairly correctly, then he ought not to be overextended. Black plays pawn to queen 3. White plays 8, knight to king's bishop 3, bishop to king's knight 2, 9, pawn to king 4, exclamation mark, which is diagram B1. Black now plays bishop takes bishop. Now switch off your cassette and decide which capture you think is best for White. I hope you realise that if White now plays king takes bishop, it takes him a further 3 moves to get his king into safety and his rook along the king's bishop file. But if White plays rook takes bishop, then he only spends 2 moves with king to bishop 2 to knight 1, safeguarding his king. This may seem a rather odd way of castling to you, and indeed it is, but White's a pawn up, he's got a strong centre. As long as his king gets to safety, his chances are very good. So White plays rook takes bishop, and Black plays castles. White plays king to bishop 2, Black plays queen's knight to queen 2. This is diagram B2. Instead of queen to knight to queen 2, black can also play queen to knight 3. So retract queen's knight to queen 2, retract the knight back to knight 1, and play queen to knight 3. This intends to put pressure along the G1 A7 diagonal. Now white's best is king to knight 1, knight to rook 3, pawn to king 5, knight to queen 2. The game Muraj Platonov played in Russia in '74 now went 14, queen to king 1, knight to bishop 2, king to rook 1, queen to rook 3. Though it may well be that in some cases king 2 is a better square for white's queen. Anyway, this position which arises is better for white. White has chances of breaking through the centre with pawn to king 6 and pawn to bishop 5, and perhaps at some time playing queen to rook 4 and putting pressure against black's king side and centre before black has time to play against white's queen side. Now return to the position, diagram B2. White now played 12, king to knight 1. Black played knight to knight 3. This intends to counter white's idea of pawn to king 5, because if white plays pawn to king 5 here, black can play pawn takes pawn, followed by knight takes queen's pawn. In this way black hopes to stop pawn to king 5 for rather a long time. Black also has possibilities of playing knight to rook 5, exchanging off white's queen's knight, and therefore removing a defensive piece from white's queen side. White now played 13, king to rook 1. Black played queen to queen 2, hitting down along both the h3 c8 diagonals and the a4 e8 diagonal. White played 14, queen to bishop 2. Now switch off your cassette and study this position for a few minutes. Black played king's rook to queen's knight 1. White played 15, rook to knight 1. Many of you will now feel this position is beginning to resemble a normal type of Benko gambit structure. However, it's rather different because white's got his central pawns moving very fast, and at some point he will be able to strike out with pawn to king 5 and therefore block off black's pressure while at the same time creating his own counterplay in the centre. Black now played knight to rook 5, and white played knight to queen 1 exclamation mark. This is diagram B3. White prefers to keep his knight and hope that one day it will go to queen's bishop 4 via king 3. Also, he wishes to gain a tempo by using black's knight on queen's rook 5 as a target. He is going to play pawn to queen's knight 3 next, followed later by bishop to queen's knight 2. In this way, by placing a bishop along the a1 h8 diagonal, white is neutralizing the pressure of black's bishop, while also putting further pressure on the square king 5. Black felt now that his queenside play was rather emasculated, and therefore decided it was about time to strike out in the centre, and so played 16, pawn to king 3. White now played pawn to queen to knight 3. Black played queen to knight 4, stopping pawn takes knight because of queen takes rook on king's bishop 1, or queen's knight 1. White now played 18, knight to queen 2, exclamation mark, defending both rooks and simultaneously attacking black's knight. Black played knight to knight 3, it's the only square. White played pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. White now played 20, bishop to knight 2, putting pressure on the centre, and black played queen to rook 3. Of course, black can't play rook takes rook's pawn, because then white has knight to queen's bishop 3, forking the queen and rook. White now played 21, knight to king 3, overprotecting the queen's bishop 4 square. And black can't play queen takes rook's pawn here because of rook to rook 1, winning the queen. Black now played knight on queen's knight 3 to queen 2. White played pawn to queen's rook 4. Now black really hasn't got any play at all. White's got more pressure on the centre than black, and black's got no play against white's queenside pawns. They're all very nicely defended. So black now decided it was about time to attempt to strike out. So he played pawn to queen 4, which is probably his best try. White now played pawn takes pawn. Black recaptured with the pawn. Now switch off your recorder and see what you think white's best move is. White played bishop to king 5. This is very important, as white must get his bishop onto this square before black plays pawn to queen 5, which would cut it out completely for the rest of the game. Black now played rook to king 1. White played knight to king's bishop 3. Black played pawn to queen 5. White played knight to bishop 4. Black plays knight takes bishop. White plays pawn takes knight. Knight to queen 4. Knight to queen 6. Apart from attacking the rook on king 1, it's also eyeing the f7 square. Black plays knight to king 6. And now switch off your cassette and analyse the position and try to see what you think white's best move is. White now played 29, queen takes bishop's pawn, exclamation mark. Black can't play knight takes rook now, because white has Greco's mate, with queen to queen 5 check, king to rook 1, of king to bishop 1, then queen to bishop 7 mate, queen to queen 5 check, king to rook 1, knight to bishop 7 check, king to knight 1, knight to rook 6 check, king to rook 1, queen to knight 8 check, rook takes queen, knight to bishop 7 mate. So black now played queen to king 7, hoping to generate counterplay against white's king. This is the kind of position where white players could falter, because white's been better the whole game, and with best play he ought to win. But he's now got to defend for a bit, and a lot of white players would tend to crack up in such a situation. White played rook to king's knight 1. Black played rook to king's bishop 1. White played queen takes pawn. White's now 3 pawns up. Now switch off your recorder and see what you think Black's best move is here. Black played Rook takes Knight. Which is very dangerous, as White can't play Pawn takes Rook because of Queen takes Pawn check, Rook to Knight 2, Queen takes Rook mate. However, White's defending coolly, and he'd seen all this up to here. He now played Queen's Rook to King 1. Exclamation mark. Black plays Queen to King's Bishop 7. White plays Rook takes Knight. Black recaptures with the Rook. White now plays Queen to Queen 5 check. Black plays King to Rook 1. White now played Queen takes Rook check. There's no Greco mate in this position, as Black's Queen is covering the King's Bishop 2 square. In answer to White's Queen takes Rook check, Black plays Bishop to Bishop 1. White now played Queen to Rook 7. Black played Queen to Bishop 5. White's obviously winning, but there are quite a lot of tactical chances against White's king, and White's queen's offside, so White has to be careful for quite some time. White played 37 Queen to Knight 6. Black played Rook takes King's Pawn. White played 38 Knight to Bishop 4. Rook to King's Rook 4. Pawn to King's Knight 3. Queen to Bishop 6 check. Rook to Knight 2. Black now played 40 Rook to Queen 4. Seems quite evident that both players are in rather bad time trouble during the last maybe 5-10 moves, because Black, instead of Rook to Queen 4, ought to have played Queen to Queen 8 check, and after Queen to Knight 1 played Queen takes Pawn, but White's still winning after Queen to Queen 4 check, though it's a little harder than in the actual game. However, Black played 40 Rook to Queen 4. White now played 41 Pawn to King's Rook 4, creating space for the king. Black played Bishop to Bishop 4. Queen to Knight 8 check. King to Knight 2. King to Rook 2. Rook to King's Bishop 4. Pawn to Queen's Rook 5. Tiptoeing down the A file. Black played Queen to Queen 8. Queen to Bishop 7 check. King to Knight 1. Pawn to King's Knight 4. Black now played Queen to King 8, threatening Queen takes Rook's pawn mate. So White played Queen to Knight 3. Bishop to Bishop 7. Queen to Queen 3. Rook to Bishop 2. Queen to Queen 2. Queen to King's Bishop 8. White now played 50 Knight to King 5. Black played Bishop to King 8. White played Queen to King 2. White played Queen to Bishop 5 check. White played King to Rook 1, and then we'll check. Black played Rook to King 2. White now played Queen to Bishop 4 check. And now, after Queen takes Queen, white plays knight takes queen, and black resigned, because in a few moves white's going to queen his a pawn. That was the original game played with this line, and now we're going to look at a game where black is supposed to have improved upon Platonov's previous play. This is the game Bukic-Sovrevsky. 1. Pawn to queen 4, knight to king's bishop 3. 2. Pawn to queen's bishop 4, pawn to bishop 4. I hope by now you'll be able to start reading these moves off quite quickly. 3. Pawn to queen 5, pawn to queen's knight 4. 4. Pawn takes pawn, pawn to queen's rook 3. Pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn. 6. Knight to queen's bishop 3, pawn to queen 3. 7. Pawn to king's bishop 4, pawn to king's knight 3. 8. Knight to king's bishop 3, bishop to knight 2. 9. Pawn to king 4, bishop takes bishop, rook takes bishop, castles. 11. King to bishop 2, queen to knight 3. 12. King to knight 1, queen to knight to queen 2. This was the new idea. The idea is to allow pawn to king 5 and to provoke it, and then once white's played pawn to king 5 to treat it as a weakness and try and attack it. This plan though could well backfire, as often over-provocation does. White now played 13, queen to king 1. Diagram b4. Black played pawn to bishop 5 check. White played 14, bishop to king 3, which is rather more double-edged than it looks. He was rather worried about playing king to rook 1, because then black has knight to bishop 4 to queen 6. So black plays 14, queen takes knight's pawn. And white plays 15, pawn to king 5, with the idea of bishop to queen 4 and queen to rook 4 and knight to knight 5, and basically trying to crush black through the centre. If black now takes with the pawn, white recaptures with the pawn followed by bishop to queen 4, and he's much better. However, black plays knight to king 1. White plays 16, bishop to queen 4, queen to rook 6. Now 17, pawn to king's rook 4, knight to bishop 2, exclamation mark. At first glance, it looks as though white's position is very strong here, and because he's held his centre pawns. However, he's made a bad mistake of giving the pawn back. He should try and reach similar positions without giving up the queen's knight pawn. White now plays 18, pawn to rook 5. Perhaps pawn to king 6 is better. That leads to very unclear positions. After pawn to rook 5, black plays pawn to king 3, exclamation mark. This move's going to bash up the centre, and it's going to leave rather a vacuum at the end. All the pawns are going to disappear. But black isn't a pawn down in this position, so he's really equalising. White plays rook's pawn takes pawn. Black plays bishop's pawn takes pawn. White plays pawn takes queen's pawn. Black plays queen takes pawn. White plays bishop takes bishop. King takes bishop. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Now the game was agreed drawn. Now return to the position diagram B4 after white's 13 queen to king 1 in this game. Queen to king 1 seems rather a weak move, so retract it and play instead queen to king 2. This is much better. White isn't vulnerable to knight to bishop 4 to queen 6 at some stage, and the queen on king 2 defends the queen's knight pawn. So if black tries to play as in the game with pawn to bishop 5 check, I can simply play bishop to king 3, followed by bishop to queen 4 and pawn to king 5 and queen to rook 4 with the same kind of pressure as in the game, but he's still got his extra queen's knight pawn. So if black does manage to exchange off white's strong centre pawns, white still has his extra pawn. Also, queen to king 2 allows the possibility of queen's rook to king 1, putting further pressure along the e-file. This now concludes our examination of line 2, and there will be another short interlude before we go on to examine line 3. Now we'll turn to examine line 3. Both plans A and B were an attempt to block out black's normal aggressive intentions in the Benko gambit. But plan 3, or C, whatever you want to call it, is an attempt to bypass all of this and create a completely new structure. The line is very tactical, very sharp, and very new, and there's a very good chance you'll be able to surprise your opponent with it. You're completely altering the structure of the game, and you're the one who's going to cheapo black, if anyone's going to cheapo anyone. Black's given no queenside play because he's got to have his pawns in the way, and there have been a lot of rather quick wins for white in Grandmaster games with this line. This line is really ideal for the white player who plays pawn to queen 4 aggressively, say with the same as King's Indian and the exchange Grunfeld, but doesn't like having to defend for hours and hours in the vulgar gambit. Sorry, the Benko gambit. Now plan C occurs after the following moves. 1. Pawn to queen 4, knight to king's bishop 3. 2. Pawn to queen's bishop 4, pawn to bishop 4. 3. Pawn to queen 5, pawn to queen's knight 4. 4. Pawn takes pawn, pawn to queen's rook 3. 5. A knight to queen's bishop 3. This is diagram C1. Black now plays 5. Pawn takes pawn, and if he doesn't, then white will just play as in line 1, but with an extra tempo. He'll play pawn to king 4, pawn to queen's rook 4, queen to knight 3, rook to rook 3, and he'll have the same structure as in plan A, but he won't have to waste a move playing pawn to king 4, because in plan A he had to play pawn to king 3 and then pawn to king 4. So white gets this very good structure also with an extra move, so it's very good for him. So in this position all black players have played pawn takes pawn. White now played pawn to king 4, and black now plays pawn to knight 5, which seems forced, as if black plays pawn to queen 3 instead, then white simply plays bishop takes pawn followed by king's knight to king 2, and black doesn't have enough play for the pawn. White now plays knight to knight 5, and black plays pawn to queen 3. which is diagram C2. Of course, black can't play knight takes pawn here, knight takes king's pawn that is, instead of pawn to queen 3, because white plays queen to king 2. Black plays pawn to king's bishop 4, white plays pawn to bishop 3, black plays knight to king's bishop 3, then you play knight to queen 6 mate. But after return to the position diagram C2. White's 8th move is now crucial, and he has to choose between knight to bishop 3 or bishop to bishop 4. The main drawback with White's position is that his knight on knight 5 might get stuck. I mean, it can't get back, and Black might be able to get it with bishop to rook 3 and rook to queen's knight 1 and queen to rook 4 at some stage. So before Black has a chance to get it, White has to create tactical chances. These tactical chances are often based on the break pawn to king 5, and after Black takes, White takes back either with bishop, queen or knight with pressure down the centre. So White has two possibilities here, either bishop to bishop 4 or knight to bishop 3. Bishop to bishop 4 is actually weaker than knight to bishop 3, but first we'll examine it to see what's wrong with it, because on the surface it seems very good. Of course, bishop to bishop 4 here is bishop to king's bishop 4. I'm sorry if I make the occasional mistake with English descriptive notation, but I actually use algebraic notation. But I felt it was best to use English descriptive notation for this cassette, because I know that some people don't like algebraic notation. So, after 8 bishop to king's bishop 4, Black can't play knight takes pawn again, because of queen to king 2, followed by knight takes queen's pawn check. Now switch off your cassette and think for quite some time and see if you can find what Black's rather startling reply to bishop to king's bishop 4 is. I wonder if you found it. It's 8 pawn to king's knight 4, double exclamation mark. The idea is that after White plays bishop takes pawn or bishop to knight 3, Black can safely play knight takes king's pawn, because he's then attacking the bishop, and White doesn't have the cheapos based on knight takes queen's pawn check. In this way, Black's safely able to take a centre pawn for a wing pawn, and White's position beginning to crumbling with his knight out of place on knight 5, and his bishop attacked, and no central breakthrough in the offing. Now replace White's bishop at queen's bishop 1, Black's knight at king's bishop 3, Black's king's knight pawn at king's knight 2, White's king's pawn at king 4. And White now plays 8 knight to bishop 3, which is diagram C4. Of course, now you're wondering why Black can't take White's king's pawn. The answer is as follows. If Black plays knight takes king's pawn, White has two moves that promise him very good prospects. Either bishop to king's bishop 4, or he can play bishop to queen's bishop 4, pawn to king's knight 3, queen to king 2, exclamation mark, knight to king's bishop 3, bishop to king's bishop 4. Now White's threatening knight takes queen's pawn check again. Black now has to play rook to rook 3 in order to defend this, and White plays knight takes queen's pawn check, exclamation mark. Black plays rook takes knight, and White plays bishop to knight 5 check, winning, because after bishop to queen 2, White has bishop takes rook. And if bishop takes bishop, then queen takes bishop, check, and white is material up. Now return to the position diagram c4. Black's best is pawn to king's knight 3, bishop to knight 2, playing slowly, as in the game Judovic versus Kremeneski, which will be in the supplementary bulletin. After 8 knight to bishop 3, the most frequently played move by black has been queen's knight to queen 2. And now we will follow the game Chaskovsky-Albert, played in Russia in 1975. White played 9 bishop to king's bishop 4. Black played knight to queen's knight 3. Now switch off your cassette recorder and see if you can find what Chaskovsky missed. It may well be very possible that white can here play knight to king 5, and if it worked, then it definitely deserves double exclamation mark. Then, after pawn takes knight, bishop takes pawn, queen to queen 2, white simply plays queen to bishop 2, with the idea of queen takes bishop's pawn. Black really hasn't got very many moves here. White can play knight to bishop 7 check, followed by bishop to knight 5, and it seems very hard to find defences for black. However, Chaskovsky missed this and played instead rook to queen's bishop 1. With the idea of pawn to king 5. Black played knight takes king's pawn. White played bishop to queen 3. Black now played knight to king's bishop 3. Black could have played knight takes queen's pawn, but this loses. I'll leave it to you to work out why. But white does have the possibility of bishop to king 4 takes rook on queen's rook 1 sometime. White plays 12 after knight to king's bishop 3, queen to king 2, threatening knight takes pawn check. Black plays pawn to king 3. White plays pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Now white plays knight to king's knight 5, and black plays queen's knight to queen 4. This is diagram c5. If instead black had played pawn to king 4, white has bishop takes pawn, pawn takes bishop, queen takes pawn check, queen to king 2, knight to queen 6 check, king to queen 1, knight on knight 5 to bishop 7 check, king to bishop 2, rook takes bishop's pawn check, king to knight 1, knight takes bishop discovered check, queen takes queen check, rook takes queen, king takes knight, knight takes rook, and white is better. White's the exchange up, and he's also got a few extra pawns as well. Now return to the position in diagram c5. White plays 15 knight takes king's pawn. Black plays knight takes bishop. White plays knight takes knight check. Black plays bishop to king 2. White plays bishop to queen's bishop 4, exclamation mark, which stops black from castling. And if black's king gets trapped in the centre for much longer, then he's obviously in rather a lot of trouble. Black now played bishop to knight 5, pawn to king's bishop 3, bishop to bishop 4, 19 white played rook to queen 1, black played king to bishop 1, after king to bishop 1, white plays pawn to king's knight 4, black plays pawn to king knight 4. After black's pawn to king's knight 4, white plays 21, knight to king 6 check, bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, king to knight 2, queen to bishop 7 check, king to rook 3, a rather nice king hunt, 24 pawn to king rook 4, queen to king 1, pawn takes pawn check, king takes pawn, rook to queen 5 check, so that if knight takes rook, then rook to rook 5 mate. Black plays king to bishop 5, and white plays king to bishop 2, so that after queen takes queen, white has rook to bishop 5 mate. Now we'll turn to the game Rashkovsky versus Zilberman, played in the USSR in 1975. 1. Pawn to queen 4, knight to king's bishop 3. 2. Pawn to queen's bishop 4, pawn to queen's bishop 4. 3. Pawn to queen 5, pawn to queen's knight 4. 4. Pawn takes pawn, pawn to queen's rook 3. Knight to queen's bishop 3, pawn takes pawn, pawn to king 4, pawn to queen 3, pawn to knight 5. White plays knight to knight 5, black plays pawn to queen 3. White plays knight to bishop 3, black plays queen's knight to queen 2. White plays bishop to king's bishop 4, black plays knight to rook 4. White plays bishop to knight 5, which threatens knight takes pawn check, winning the queen. Black now played queen to knight 3, and white played 11, knight to queen 2, exclamation mark. Pawn to king's knight 3, and white played 12, knight to bishop 4. Of course black can't play queen takes knight now because of knight takes pawn check, and if pawn takes knight then bishop takes queen. So black now plays queen to knight 1. White now plays 13 pawn to queen's rook 4 to protect his stranded knight on queen's knight 5. Black plays bishop to knight 2. White plays bishop to queen 3. Black plays pawn to king's rook 3. Bishop to king 3. Bishop to queen's rook 3. Black's trying to get rid of one of white's knights, because white's got a kind of Benoni type position where the queen side's blocked, so black doesn't have the usual play there, and where in the long run he can just try and break through with pawn to king's bishop 4 to king 5. White now played 16 castles. Black played castles. White played 17 queen to queen 2. And he now stands quite a lot better. Black had to defend his king rook's pawn, and so played king to rook 2. And white now played 18 pawn to king's bishop 4, exclamation mark, starting the central breakthrough. Black played knight on rook 4 to king's bishop 3. If he doesn't do that quite soon, he's going to get his knight stranded. White now played pawn to king's rook 3. This is important, as white must stop knight to knight 5, as if black is allowed to play knight to knight 5, he can follow with knight takes bishop, and he'll have control of the long black diagonal and possibilities of bishop to queen 5. So black, after white plays 19 pawn to king rook 3, black plays 19 knight to knight 3. White plays knight takes knight. Black plays queen takes knight. White plays 21 queen to bishop 2. Sorry, queen to queen's bishop 2. Descriptive notation again. White plays 21 knight to queen 2. And now white should have played, well, I'll leave it to you to see if you can find what white should have played. Switch off your recorder and think about the position for a few minutes and see if you can work out what white's best continuation is. I wonder if you found it. White should play pawn to king 5, and after black plays pawn takes pawn, white plays pawn to bishop 5. This is what Hans Kmoch refers to in his book Pawn Power in Chess as a sealer sweeper, because the move is sweeping open the position for white's pieces to get at black's king, while at the same time black's bishop on king's knight 2, which is usually the main focus of his counterplay, is blocked out. Black really hasn't got very much play in this position. If he plays pawn to king 5, white can simply recapture, and having the bishop out doesn't really do that much. And apart from that, black can really just sit there and do nothing, and white can play things like pawn to king's knight 4 to knight 5, or queen's rook to king 1, or bishop to king 4, and so white's an awful lot better in that position. Black really hasn't got any play at all. Now we'll turn to the game Van den Steen Geodordinengo, which won the Brilliancy Prize at the Biel Open 1976. To my knowledge, this game hasn't been seen in England before, and this is the first time it's going to be, as it were, published. This year at Biel, they held one of the interzonal tournaments, and Bill Raines, who's an English player, who plays at Athenaeum Club, was Robert Huebner's second, and I'm indebted to him for giving me this game. They hold an open tournament at Biel every year, and this year the open tournament was played parallel with the Grandmaster tournament. Rather like the way that tournaments at Hastings, you can play in subsidiary sections and watch the Grandmaster tournament at the same time. Well, the game went pawn to queen 4, knight to king's bishop 3, 2, pawn to queen's bishop 4, pawn to bishop 4, 3, pawn to queen 5, pawn to queen's knight 4, 4, pawn takes pawn, pawn to queen's rook 3, knight to queen's bishop 3, pawn takes pawn, pawn to king 4, pawn to knight 5, knight to knight 5, pawn to queen 3, knight to king's bishop 3, queen's knight to queen 2, bishop to king's bishop 4, knight to king's rook 4, bishop to knight 5, Knight on rook 4 to bishop 3. No doubt hoping for bishop to bishop 4, draw agreed. But white played pawn to king 5, exclamation mark. Diagram C6. Now, pawn takes pawn was played in the game. However, if knight takes pawn, then white plays knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, queen to king 2, followed by queen takes pawn, bishop to queen's bishop 4, and white's better. White can also play bishop to queen's bishop 4, and then queen to king 2, and he's also better there. Now return to the position in diagram C6. Black plays pawn takes pawn. White plays 12, queen to king 2. And black now plays bishop to queen's rook 3. Retract bishop to queen's rook 3. And we'll examine other possibilities. Black can't play knight takes queen's pawn, because then white has knight to queen 6 check. Also, if black plays pawn to king 5, then white can play bishop to king's bishop 4, so that after pawn takes knight, white has knight to queen 6 check. And if black doesn't play pawn takes knight, then white has simply knight to bishop 7 check. If black plays 12, rook to rook 4, white plays knight takes king's pawn. Black plays knight takes knight. White plays 14, queen takes knight. Black plays queen to knight 3. White plays knight to bishop 7 check. Black plays king to queen 1. White plays bishop to king's bishop 4. And white's much better. Now return to the position in diagram C6 again, and we'll continue with the game. Black played pawn takes pawn. White played queen to king 2. Black played bishop to queen's rook 3. White now played knight takes king's pawn. And black played rook to knight 1. This is diagram C7. If instead of this, instead of rook to knight 1, black had played bishop takes knight, white plays queen takes bishop. If black then plays rook to knight 1, white has bishop takes knight on king's bishop 3, exclamation mark. And after rook takes queen, white plays bishop takes rook. Black plays pawn takes bishop. King's pawn takes bishop. White plays bishop takes knight check. Black plays king to king 2. White plays knight to bishop 6 check. Black plays king takes bishop. White plays knight takes queen. Black plays king takes knight. White's now the exchange up, and he can also here play pawn to queen's rook 4 and try and queen his passed a pawn. White's winning this position. Also, black's bishop is rather bad. Now turn to now let us return to the position in diagram C7. Black's just played rook to knight 1. Now switch off your cassette and see if you can find out White's elegant reply. I hope you've found it. White plays 14, knight takes bishop's pawn, exclamation mark. Black now played king takes knight. If black doesn't play king takes knight, then white has knight to queen 6 mate. So black played king takes knight, and again we have another king hunt. White played queen to king 6 check, king to knight 3, bishop to queen 3 check, king takes bishop, 17 pawn to king rook 4 check, king to rook 3, 18 queen to king 3, and mate next move. Well, that concludes my survey of the 3 lines that I'm giving against the Benko gambit. I hope you found at least one of them appealing, but I think all 3 are really rather good for white. They cut across black's main play in the Benko. You'll be able to surprise your opponent with them, probably, and you'll be able to get him into positions that he doesn't know very well. Audio chess may soon be catching on to quite a large degree, and apart from being able to buy cassettes, there's a library service being formed where people can hire cassettes for less than the cost of buying them, and there's also personal tuition given by cassette. I'd be very happy to answer any questions on any of the lines suggested here, and you can always write to me or ring me at 1 Birkbeck Road, Birkbeck, Acton, London W3, and my telephone number is 01 992 9100. Well, I've enjoyed making this cassette, and I hope you enjoy listening to it. By the way, the flute music was by courtesy of Basman's Busker, whoever he may be.